So it's me again. I'm gonna record a couple of presentations this morning, so you're gonna see me looking like this with morning hair for a few lessons. So I'm gonna start with this short one on business for peace. So it kind of crosses over two topics there with social enterprise that we've been looking at in the alternative weeks and with peace studies. Um, so, the first thing to think about, and yes, these lessons that I'm recording are thought of as things to do in small groups, so that you do get a chance to chat. I mean, you can also do it by yourself, of course, and having a think about these things. So, peace is often seen as this very hedonistic or utopian idea, and also on the side of good. And then you have, of course, war and capitalism and this money making maybe on the side of bad. So there are many people that think or automatically think that peace should be something that you do in an organization, in a charity, in a government, something that you're not necessarily making money out of. And that's why the curiosity with this question of what are your thoughts on making money out of peace? Could there be arguments for peace being something that it's okay to make a lot of money out of? And would this not then make it more appealing, or should peace always be something that's done from the goodness of your heart and never something that is profit? And then the second part to this question, with what kind of businesses profit or gain in the creation of peace? We hear very much about the businesses that gain, that do well in the creation of conflict, armaments industries, food industries, transport industries. A lot of places receive money and funding in wartime. I'm just reading a great book by Rebecca Solnit at the moment. Didn't even realize it was a book by her. And her first is a collection of essays on landscape and gender. And her first essay in this book is about the creation of the nuclear weapons, and how, of course, wartime allowed for a lot of funding to be put in this area. She also rather interestingly links the whole situation to the creation story, because in the creation story, people are expelled from paradise, and then comes all the destruction. And in the nuclear story, the physicists are expelled from their home countries and then come to build destruction. But yeah, I will shut up for a second, or more appropriately, you can pause me here and have a think about what your answers are to the questions before I continue to say my thoughts on it. So now the awkward. Oh, I can have. So, what are my thoughts on making money out of peace? I think it's a great idea. I think if we are going to continue to live in a capitalist society, then it is important that peace becomes something associated with something profitable. In a capitalist society, you basically have the idea that your worth as a person is dependent on your contribution to the society. Thus why perhaps one of the first questions we ask adults is what do you do? Because worth equals what do you do? And if what you do is not income generating, is not contributing to taxes, all this kind of thing, then it's not necessarily seen as worth. So I think making money out of peace should be, in a capitalist system, should be necessary. And it doesn't take away from the fact that this is a perhaps emotional value as well, I don't think. It's not trying to monetize people's goodwill. It's not trying to say that the only motivations humans have are money, because I would really hate that to be the case. But I think if there were subsidies given, support, just as in Denmark you have support for entrepreneurs, if there were, particular support given for entrepreneurs that are trying to assure this. And I think it is also already a money-making business. People that work for the UN, people that work for different organizations, they are, of course, being paid a wage, and they should be paid a wage that is market appropriate. Of course, I don't agree with people being able to fly first class and live like the 1%, because I'm not a socialist per se. I do see I don't know politically where I stand, but where I do stand is I don't think that there should be people with enormous amounts of wealth and people without. But I don't right now understand in society how we can say, oh, well, people that are working for charities, people that are working for the good of the planet should be taking a cut in wages compared to people that are in profit-making businesses, because that doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, people are working, people are contributing, and therefore should be rewarded for that. So I guess that's where I was going with my thoughts on this, that I think we have to wonder sometimes when we're critical of, I'm seeing, of course, with what's going on in the world now, a lot of people saying, remembering that it's not the banks and the billionaires that are getting us out of this situation. It is the people that are probably on the lowest of wages, which is government workers, janitors, cleaners, nurses, all these kinds of jobs, which we don't pay as good of money as perhaps somebody working in app building or something. Not that that can't also be. So to the second part of the question, what kind of businesses profit or gain in the creation of peace? Yeah, perhaps it's naive, perhaps it's Arcadian or utopian. I'm just learning the difference between these terms, and I think all businesses should gain and profit in the creation of peace. We shouldn't be looking for, reading articles recently of these people that live on selling trend items, which, perfect. But what they were doing was stockpiling hand sanitizer and saying, well, this is how I live on trend items. And it's like, this is not a trend item. You should be able to tell the difference between those two things. So yeah, perhaps an idealistic answer, but what kind of businesses profit and gain in the creation of peace? I think should be all of them. And then this question of how much does peace then cost? Because this is very often when we're looking at post-conflict times, when we are looking at developing world, when we're looking even at the developed world, there's this idea that peace just costs too much. In order to get us to a place of positive peace, it costs too much, whether this cost is moral, whether this cost is spiritual, whether this cost is economic, emotional, that there have to be limits, and that sometimes the cost is too much and we must prepare. And this is these, oh, now I forget the name for it. So you have pacifist, and then you have like a situational pacifist, and a lot of people are this, where it's like there is a line beyond which peace costs too much. And what I was curious in doing this presentation was seeing if we could actually calculate what peace costs. So there's a great website. It's called Visions of Humanity, and they run the Global Peace Index, which is a yearly report, which uses 7 pillars to calculate and rank countries in their level of peace. And of course, it's just one set. I mean, it's a lot of information that they gather, but it's one organization doing this. So you might totally disagree. But just to take as a starting figure, so they also then calculate how much violence costs and what are they looking at in terms of violence and peace. So they're registering in terms of positive peace. So these costs that they're talking about here, they include war, they include civil war, they include refugees and internally displaced people. They concern the prison complex, they concern police. All these kinds of things are included in when they're calculating what violence costs. So they take it down to about $2,000 per person per year is what violence costs. And this is, of course, just a financial cost of all those systems. This is not the emotional, moral, spiritual, all those kinds of costs that are also a level in this. And so if we, and these figures are going to be a bit all over the place, and I'm also going to move my little bubble here if I can. Okay. And even maybe turn me off so I don't keep looking at me. So these are some calculations, and you can see, so for example, one cost of peace is the UN peacekeeping. This includes mission, a lot of, as you can see, there are 13 different operations. So 6.69 billion in 2018 to 19, and 6.51 billion for the years 2019 to 20. Sorry, I haven't looked up, but we're not gonna have, well, we will have the budget for 20 to 21 right now. So that's one possible cost. And the UN peacekeeping, these are 13 operations that are in place and will be a variance from peace keeping to peace enforcement. The difference being their mandate to use force while they're there. So some of these missions will be election observances, some of them will be observing neutral zones, some of them will be observing ceasefire, some of them will be training up police and military. So these missions, they contain an awful lot. So it might seem a lot of money for these operations, but these operations are basically getting a country back, doing the first stages of rehabilitation, because of course rehabilitation takes a long time. And then I took some particular countries. These, I'm guessing, were the countries of my class at that time. And also, so UK, my home country, spends between 13.4 and 14.5 billion pounds on aid. So this would be positive peace cost in terms of putting money into water projects, health projects, infrastructure projects, all these kind of things, so that when different countries and projects can apply for funding, if they apply to the UK and they fit under the thematic schemes that we're going, and they seem to probably be a low risk because this is still about entrepreneurial, or they fit with the profile of the UK aid agency, then they would receive some of this money. In Japan, you can see this is the 4th largest globally. I don't even think they are the 4th largest economy globally, but I'm not sure. I'm not things. They sent $14.5 billion on aid. In Belgium, we have 1,235 million, and you can see as part of the budget. The US, 39 million. Denmark, 2.57 billion. Korea, 2.4 billion. The Swiss, 3.022 billion. We can see here Macedonia and Mexico are recipients of aid rather than those that saying that. 7.4 billion in Germany, and Iceland 0.04 billion. So a lot of money there being spent on peace projects through different methodologies. This is a breakdown of the different organizations. So this 39 million that we see here in the US, these are the different organizations that will be funding aid projects around the world. So we can see that 39 million is spread amongst a lot of different organizations. We have the World Bank that just announced another, well, not just, in 2019, announced 200 billion towards fighting global climate change over 5 years. So that was 62.3 billion in 2019. Why climate change is on here when a cost of peace, if we're talking positive peace, that also includes having a healthy and sustainable environment that people can, of course, thrive in and live in healthily. A lot of news from the coronavirus now talking about how it's actually helping environmentally, that less cars are out, all this kind of thing. The European Union, 13.85 billion on this level of climate change, and the African Union, 400 million initial setup fund in 2016, and 55.9 million been added since 2017. So you can see, of course, this is an area of a lot of political attention right now, and so there's a lot of funding going into this area. But we can see a lot of money being invested into peace. And this is fundings from different organizations. You can compare. So you, for example, you have the UN development project that's up here. This UK DFID is our development aid program. I don't have all of the names in my head right now, but it's just to give an example of the different organizations and what they are investing. What is the conclusion from this? You can find lots of different figures. If we're talking positive peace and we're looking at the environment, we're looking at education, we're looking at business, we're looking at communication skills, we're looking at investment in entrepreneurship. Despite us saying that it's super expensive or it's out of reach, conclusion, we have absolutely no idea how much peace costs, because we're not there. We're not necessarily investing. We do invest in some areas. Usually it's on a thematic focus, but we don't actually know. Nobody has calculated what peace actually costs a country. It seems much easier, although it's not even simplistic. I don't even think we have clear figures, as much as the Visions of Humanity website is saying it's around $2,000 per person per year. This is also an estimate based on particular pieces of information and missing perhaps others. For example, the cost of veterans returning from conflict, the cost of workers in armaments factories, all sorts of things that are possibly not included in those statistics. What we can see, and this is again from statistics released by the Visions of Humanity is that higher income, so countries that are more wealthy, appear to be more peaceful. So we see like the darkest blue column there is lower down. High income countries have the most amount of positive peace, possibly because, for example, like Denmark, they're able to afford a welfare state, and then we have low income here with the less peaceful. Remember that we're measuring positive peace here, so we are not necessarily measuring just open and direct conflict. And of course, here we can also see that a lot of high income countries shift their open and direct conflict over to low income countries. So, for example, British forces fighting in Syria and Afghanistan are contributing to this negative peace in lower income countries. And we see that countries that are growing in wealth, so gross domestic product, that's what GDP stands for, those that have a higher average growth are more peaceful, seeming to imply that the wealthier you are, the more peaceful you are. Leading to the question, does money bring peace, or does peace bring money? And again, you can pause me here and have a chat about this, have a think about this. Also gives me a little moment to put my head together. I'm not sure that it's easy to find an answer to this. I gave some examples when we were just looking at those graphs that higher income countries can shift some of their violence over to other countries. My question would also be, people that are making these kinds of statistics are probably coming from high income countries, and what blind spots do we have to the types of violence that are going on in theories of nonviolence. We talked about Galton's theory of direct structural and cultural violence. And I think a lot of the countries that perhaps are here in the growth with GDP and the high income level are ignoring levels of structural and cultural violence. So ignoring xenophobia, ignoring racism, ignoring ableism, sexism, many of the other isms in their statistics here. So talking about, okay, I mean, and it's also hard for me to believe because probably the US is sitting in those high income levels, but if we think of the prison industrial complex in the US, it's quite scary how many people and how much money. But where those statistics might be getting lost is, of course, that in the US, that system is privatized to a large scale, which means prisons are privately owned, which might mean that that money and costs is not being taken into account in the statistics. So I do think money, of course, allows you to invest in different projects. Money in the country where we're living now, Denmark, for example, allows for a strong welfare state. Of course, this is one of the things that is going to suffer post-corona. So be interesting to see how that develops. But I think, and again, this might be a naive, idealistic approach, but I think it's chicken and egg kind of question here. I think money helps peace, and peace helps bring money in. How does peace help bring money in? Well, we don't want to invest in places where it is a risk. We tend to, no matter how good-hearted we think we might be, we tend to be quite greedy as a species. And therefore, when we have money, we don't necessarily want to risk it in ventures where we feel like it can just get lost. I mean, of course, we have philanthropy and all these kinds of things, and I'm not saying that people do not invest in risky things. Of course, they do, but then they also put part of that money into things that are more secure. So I think both sides of this question apply. And then returning back to a message that I started with at the beginning of this is that peace is charity or organizational work, that it's something that should be done from the good of your heart. I've already said that I necessarily disagree with this, because I think that people should be rewarded for what they do. People need to be on a living wage, all these kinds of things. But again, you can pause me and have a little chat about whether you think that it rightly sits predominantly in this charity, non-governmental, organizational workspace area. These are some of the examples. Again, not just, so Oxfam is a British one, which I'm going to go into in a bit more detail. The Rainbow Youth Centre, Peace Boat, Peace Bell, Women Mobilizing to End the War, Korea Peace Now. These are Japanese and Korean. We have Greenpeace, which started, I believe, in the UK. Mellemfolkelige Samvirke, or Action Aid, which is global. Mellemfolkelige Samvirke is the Danish description of this. And then we have a Swiss example there as well. But these are the kind of people, we see it in the title of their organizations. This is where a lot of this positive peace and negative peace work is being done. So how do these organizations and charities get their money? They can be given it, so voluntary donations. If you go onto a lot of these websites, you'll probably find a place where you can become a member or you can send money. They might be the types of groups that come around a couple of times a year with boxes to collect money. UNICEF, for example, have a collaboration with EasyJet. So when you fly with EasyJet, you can donate money this way. Private individuals who want to be philanthropic and donate, they can do that. So that's one way that these people, they can earn it. So this is kind of social enterprise area where they sell products, whether it's Christmas cards, produce, things made by local women, coffee beans, whatever it is that they, in the area that they're working in, they sell these products or public services. It might also be selling education. Action Aid do a lot of this. They have a lot of online education things, conferences, sharing skills with other organizations and governments, reports. All of these things could be funded in different ways. And then they can be given a grant. So the kind that governments and the World Bank give, these are usually of a larger amount and usually, of course, given to larger organizations or partner organizations. So it's much easier to get funding and grants, perhaps if you are associated with the development program of a particular country, a larger organization, you work under the UN umbrella or the World Bank umbrella, all these kinds of things. So this is kind of three revenue streams, and most charities and non-governmental organizations use all three of these. So if we look at Oxfam, for example, this is back in 2019. They had a £409 million budget. And you would think, okay, well, then a lot of that's coming from grants. No, 7% of that comes from the government. 26% from donations. So Oxfam also have a lot of clothing stores, and they sell different produce from their projects. And you can see this is a large part of where they are getting their funds from. Then 3/4 of their budget is on charitable work, and that's around £303.5 million, and the rest is on wages and running costs. So there's a lot of people that work in the stores, that working on projects around the world. It's not necessarily going to the CEOs being incredibly wealthy, although of course we can always find stories of a CEO flying first class somewhere, living in an expensive neighborhood, being headhunted from another kind of lifestyle, another kind of work, and expecting that same kind of money, which in my mind would also be realistic if you're doing the same kind of job. So what are the challenges to these kinds of organizations and charities getting their income? Changes in government. We've seen, for example, with Trump coming into power, that a lot of US organizations and US affiliated organizations, any of those organizations that even mentioned abortion, so they weren't performing abortions, they were just giving information about it, had their funding cut. So that change in government can completely cut off one of those revenue streams. Donor fatigue. We're going to hear about that in a little bit. Ooh, yeah, there's a TED Talk coming up with Melinda Gates, where she speaks about how, for example, polio was almost wiped out as a disease that we experience as humans on this planet. But because it was so close and was not really a pressing issue in so many people's lives, that the funding was then cut to this area. So yeah, we can get tired of hearing about particular things. Also, sometimes I think I remember also my mum and my grandma, they both contribute to different charities that they believe in. And my mum started by, I think, putting like £20 a month towards homeless shelters. And in the next year, when she received her letter, the lowest amount she could give was like £200. And so this kind of price increases following. And clearly, of course, these organizations need money, but it's also sometimes the way they go about asking. My grandma, for example, once gave some money and then would receive 10 to 20 letters from different charities a week, which, you know, was very disheartening and difficult emotionally, because you want to be able to help, but this was just kind of making you feel that it was never enough, and that can then be difficult. Demonstrating impact. When somebody invests money in a project, they want to see that that project has been successful. And of course, charities and non-governmental organizations are great at writing their reports of showing, but culture change, rehabilitation of people, you know, cannot not usually be done in short-term plans. So if you're looking at 3 years to shift something, you might not necessarily see enormous amounts of impact, and that then can be difficult for investors to keep their money in, because they want to see, you know, quick, fast results, placing the same kind of pressure on organizations as is placed on businesses, and it's not necessarily the way. Financial crises, of course, money then needs to go into other pools, and there is not so much available for development aid, again, after this initial wave of the coronavirus here. It'll be interesting to see how development aid budgets change for different countries. Misunderstandings about people's work, what they're actually doing, and even interest rates, right? About even as an organization, right now the interest rates are going to not be great for people. So, yeah, these are many things that can impact. Can peace be a business? Again, you can pause me, you can think about this, you can have a conversation about this, but I think that personally, yes, it can, and maybe even yes, it should. Yeah. I should wait here for a minute so that you can see the question, although you can press pause and you can see the question. What things can business do to help bring peace? So that's what this says on this slide. Things that businesses can do to encourage peace using marketing to cross borders, especially in the age of social media. We definitely can get messages spread so much further. A lot of businesses with their corporate social responsibility, you've probably heard CSR banded around, will use this to promote different issues. Rewarding intercultural understanding, supporting social entrepreneurs, and boosting workforce diversity. So those are a number of things that businesses can do to encourage peace. How do they encourage peace? Well, if you have an intercultural workplace, a lot of businesses, of course, have locations around the world. You, of course, need to then work on that your employees understand one another, they can communicate. So we build skills which can then be passed on in other areas, but also, as has been shown over and over again, and it's the entire purpose behind IPC as a business, for example, is to reward that intercultural understanding, to understand that when we meet other human beings face to face, all of these stereotypes and a lot of the cultural violence that we have built up about other groups of people can be diminished. And then supporting social entrepreneurs. It's a positive thing. Social entrepreneurs have as their core value positive social change. And if businesses support this either within the business in intrapreneurship, Google, for example, has funds for different projects, all this kind of thing, it can help to change. And boosting workforce diversity goes together with this intercultural understanding that we get to meet one another more face to face and have that ability to have an understanding that humans and cultures and nationalities are not necessarily as solid and as differentiated as we might think. And yeah, a little pause here to listen to this TED Talk by Melinda Gates, where she talks about what development organizations can learn from a business like Coca-Cola. And you probably wouldn't usually put Coca-Cola. Most people think of it as an evil corporation together with skills for learning to change the world for the better. But she gives some great examples here of what charities and organizations can learn from following Coca-Cola's style of business.
One of my favorite parts about my job at the Gates Foundation is that I get to travel to the developing world, and I do that quite regularly. And when I meet the mothers in so many of these remote places, I'm really struck by the things that we have in common. They want what we want for our children, and that is for their children to grow up successful, to be healthy, and have a successful life. But I also see lots of poverty, and it's quite jarring, both in the scale and the scope of it. My first trip in India, I was in a person's home where they had dirt floors, no running water, no electricity, and that's really what I see all over the world. So in short, I'm startled by all the things that they don't have. But I am surprised by one thing that they do have: Coca-Cola. Coke is everywhere. In fact, when I travel in the developing world, Coke feels ubiquitous. And so when I come back from these trips and I'm thinking about development and I'm flying home and I'm thinking, well, we're trying to deliver condoms to people or vaccinations, Coke's success kind of stops and makes you wonder, how is it that they can get Coke to these far-flung places? If they can do that, why can't governments and NGOs do the same thing? And I'm not the first person to ask this question, but I think as a community, we still have a lot to learn. It's staggering if you think about Coca-Cola. They sell 1.5 billion servings every single day. That's like every man, woman, and child on the planet having a serving of Coke every week. So why does this matter? Well, if we're going to speed up the progress and go even faster on the set of Millennium Development Goals that we've set as a world, we need to learn from the innovators. And those innovators come from every single sector. I feel that if we can understand what makes something like Coca-Cola ubiquitous, we can apply those lessons then for the public good. Coke's success is relevant because if we can analyze it, learn from it, then we can save lives. So that's why I took a bit of time to study Coke. And I think there are really three things we can take away from Coca-Cola. They take real-time data and immediately feed it back into the product. They tap into local entrepreneurial talent, and they do incredible marketing. So let's start with the data. Now, Coke has a very clear bottom line. They report to a set of shareholders. They have to turn a profit. So they take the data and they use it to measure progress. They have this very continuous feedback loop. They learn something, they put it back in the product, they put it back into the market. They have a whole team called Knowledge and Insight. It's a lot like other consumer companies. So if you're running Namibia for Coca-Cola and you have 107 constituencies, you know where every can versus bottle of Sprite, Fanta, or Coke was sold, whether it was a corner store, a supermarket, or a push cart. So if sales start to drop, then the person can identify the problem and address the issue. Well, let's contrast that for a minute to development. In development, the evaluation comes at the very end of the project. I've sat in a lot of those meetings. And by then, it is way too late to use the data. I had somebody from an NGO once describe it to me as bowling in the dark. They said, you roll the ball, you hear some pins go down, it's dark, you can't see which one goes down until the lights come on, and then you can see your impact. Real-time data turns on the lights. So what's the second thing that Coke's good at? Well, they're good at tapping into that local entrepreneurial talent. Coke's been in Africa since 1928, but most of the time they couldn't reach the distant markets because they had a system that was a lot like in the developed world, which was a large truck rolling down a street. And in Africa, the remote places, it's hard to find a good road. But Coke noticed something. They noticed that local people were taking the product, buying it in bulk, and then reselling it in these hard-to-reach places. And so they took a bit of time to learn about that. And they decided in 1990 that they wanted to start training these local entrepreneurs, giving them small loans. They set them up as what they called micro-distribution centers. And those local entrepreneurs then hire salespeople who go out with bicycles and push carts and wheelbarrows to sell the product. So there are now some 3,000 of these centers employing about 15,000 people in Africa. In Tanzania and Uganda, they represent 90% of Coke sales. So let's look at the development side. What is it that governments and NGOs can learn from Coke? Well, governments and NGOs need to tap into that local entrepreneurial talent as well, because the locals know how to reach the very hard to serve places, their neighbors, and they know what motivates them to make change. I think a great example of this is Ethiopia's new health extension program. The government noticed in Ethiopia that many of the people were so far away from a health clinic. They were over a day's travel away to the health clinic. So if you're in an emergency situation or your mom about to deliver a baby, forget it to get to the healthcare center. They decided that wasn't good enough, so they went to India and studied the Indian state of Kerala that also had a system like this, and they adapted it for Ethiopia. And in 2003, the government of Ethiopia started this new system in their own country. They trained 35,000 health extension workers to deliver care directly to the people. So in just 5 years, their ratio went from 1 worker for every 30,000 people to 1 worker for every 2,500 people. Now think about how this can change people's lives. Health extension workers can help with so many things, whether it's family planning, prenatal care, immunizations for the children, or advising the woman to get to the facility on time for an on-time delivery. That is having real impact in a country like Ethiopia. And it's why you see their child mortality numbers coming down 25% from 2000 to 2008. In Ethiopia, there are hundreds of thousands of children living because of this health extension worker program. So what's the next step for Ethiopia? Well, they're already starting to talk about this. They're starting to talk about how do you have the health community workers generate their own ideas? How do you incent them based on the impact that they're getting out in those remote villages? That's how you tap into local entrepreneurial talent and you unlock people's potential. Now, the third component of Coke's success is marketing. Ultimately, Coke's success depends on one crucial fact, and that is that people want a Coca-Cola. Now, the reason these micro-entrepreneurs can sell or make a profit is they have to sell every single bottle in their push cart or their wheelbarrow. So they rely on Coca-Cola in terms of its marketing. And what's the secret to their marketing? Well, it's aspirational. It associates that product with the kind of life that people want to live. So even though it's a global company, they take a very local approach. Coke's global campaign slogan is open happiness, but they localize it. And they don't just guess what makes people happy. They go to places like Latin America and they realize that happiness there is associated with family life. And in South Africa, they associate happiness with Sariti, or community respect. Now that played itself out in the World Cup campaign. Let's listen to this song that Coke created for it, Wavin' Flag by a Somali hip-hop artist. It feels pretty good, right? Well, they didn't stop there. They localized it into 18 different languages, and it went #1 on the pop chart in 17 countries. It reminds me of a song that I remember from my childhood, I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, that also went #1 on the pop charts. Both songs have something in common, that same appeal of celebration and unity. So how does health and development market? Well, it's based on avoidance, not aspirations. I'm sure you've heard some of these messages. Use a condom, don't get AIDS. Wash your hands, you might not get diarrhea. It doesn't sound anything like waving flag to me. And I think we make a fundamental mistake. We make an assumption that we think that if people need something, we don't have to make them want that. And I think that's a mistake. And there's some indications around the world that this is starting to change. One example is sanitation. We know that 1.5 million children die a year from diarrhea, and a lot of it is because of open defecation. But there's a solution. You build a toilet. But what we're finding around the world over and over again is if you build a toilet and you leave it there, it doesn't get used. People reuse it for a slab for their home. They sometimes store grain in it. I've even seen it used for a chicken coop. But what does marketing really entail that would make a sanitation solution get a result in diarrhea? Well, you work with the community. You start to talk to them about why open defecation is something that shouldn't be done in the village, and they agree to that. But then you take the toilet and you position it as a modern, trendy convenience. One state in northern India has gone so far as to link toilets to courtship. And it works. Look at these headlines. I'm not kidding. Women are refusing to marry men without toilets. No loo, no I do. Now, it's not just a funny headline, it's innovative. It's an innovative marketing campaign. But more importantly, it saves lives. Take a look at this. This is a room full of young men and my husband, Bill. And can you guess what the young men are waiting for? They're waiting to be circumcised. Can you believe that? We know that circumcision reduces HIV infection by 60% in men. And when we first heard this result inside the foundation, I have to admit, Bill and I were scratching our heads a little bit and we're saying, but who's going to volunteer for this procedure? But it turns out the men do, because they're hearing from their girlfriends that they prefer it, and the men also believe it improves their sex life. So if we can start to understand what people really want in health and development, we can change communities and we can change whole nations. So why is all of this so important? Well, let's talk about what happens when this all comes together, when you tie the three things together. And polio, I think, is one of the most powerful examples. We've seen a 99% reduction in polio in 20 years. So if you look back to 1988, there were about 350,000 cases of polio on the planet that year. In 2009, we're down to 1,600 cases. Well, how did that happen? Let's look at a country like India. They have over 1 billion people in this country. But they have 35,000 local doctors who report paralysis and clinicians, a huge reporting system, and chemists. They have 2.5 million vaccinators. But let me make the story a little bit more concrete for you. Let me tell you the story of Sri Ram, an 18-month boy in Bihar, a northern state in India. This year, on August 8th, he felt paralysis. And on the 13th, his parents took him to the doctor. On August 14th and 15th, they took a stool sample. And by the 25th of August, it was confirmed he had type 1 polio. By August 30th, a genetic test was done, and we knew what strain of polio Sri Ram had. Now, it could have come from one of two places. It could have come from Nepal, just to the north across the border, or from Jharkhand, a state just to the south. Luckily, the genetic testing proved that, in fact, this strand came north, because had it come from the south, it would have had a much wider impact in terms of transmission. So many more people would have been affected. So what's the end game? Well, on September 4th, there was a huge mop-up campaign, which is what you do in polio. They went out, and where Sri Ram lives, they vaccinated 2 million people. So in less than a month, we went from one case of paralysis to a targeted vaccination program. And I'm happy to say only one other person in that area got polio. That's how you keep a huge outbreak from spreading. And it shows what can happen when local people have the data in their hands. They can save lives. Now, one of the challenges in polio still is marketing, but it might not be what you think. It's not the marketing on the ground. It's not telling the parents, if you see paralysis, take your child to the doctor or get your child vaccinated. We have a problem with marketing in the donor community. The G8 nations have been incredibly generous on polio over the last 20 years, but we're starting to have something called polio fatigue, and that is that the donor nations aren't wanting to fund polio any longer. So by next summer, we're slated to run out of money on polio. So we are 99% of the way there on this goal, and we're about to run short of money. And I think that if the marketing were more aspirational, if we could focus as a community on how far we've come and how amazing it would be to eradicate this disease, we could put polio fatigue and polio behind us. And if we could do that, we could stop vaccinating everybody worldwide in all of our countries for polio. And it would only be the second disease ever wiped off the face of the planet. And we are so close, and this victory is so possible. So if Coke's marketers came to me and asked me to define happiness, I'd say my vision of happiness is a mother holding a healthy baby in her arms. To me, that is deep happiness. And so if we can learn lessons from the innovators in every sector, then in the future we make together that happiness can be just as ubiquitous as Coca-Cola. Thank you.
So, as I said, I think it's quite an inspiring video, and perhaps a task to come out of this. And feel free to send it to me if you have some ideas, is to take a look at a campaign, perhaps one of your favorite charities or organizations, or just find one at random and think about how could you turn this campaign into something aspirational, because I think that point really sits with me in the fact that because we need it, we're not supposed to want it, and yet we know when we want things, we are much more driven, we're much more motivated than just because we need to do something. So perhaps looking at, I think Kia and some of the others did this beautifully the other day when they were doing the wash your hands dance, for example, that comes out of Vietnam and other places, that it makes it something aspirational and fun, right? With this, if you were to remarket the coronavirus, which sounds horrible, marketing viruses, but how would you make that into an aspirational model? So yeah, I think those 3 points that she comes with are very good. That real-time information, so not bowling in the dark, actually figuring out what is going on and where your resources are being used, using that entrepreneurial skill. Local people know best what local people want, need, and how they function, and this whole idea of making things aspirational. I hope this was a little inspiration, and maybe, yeah, as I said, if you wanted to take a look at a campaign and see how you would have marketed it differently, how would you, get people to stay at home right now? How would you get people to use protection? What are the aspirational rather than avoidance messages that we could send? So that's my input for now. Hope it's interesting, and I'll be along soon with a few other lessons.